In a world of gods and monsters, the most dangerous player is a psychology professor named Schiller, and he's treating the hero's psyche as his personal chessboard. He began by deconstructing Bruce Wayne's carefully built facade, cornering Batman and Commissioner Gordon into a fragile alliance by weaponizing their mutual distrust. His scalpel, like intellect, then turned to Hell's Kitchen, exposing the raw nerve of Daredevil's past before deflating Tony Stark's ego and sixing him on a certain rookie. That rookie, Peter Parker, just learned that great power means nothing when pride gets you drugged and beaten unconscious in an underground fight club. He awakens to a brutal mentorship under Daredevil, a vigilante who sees Peter not as a hero, but as a raw, naive, and powerful blank slate to be molded. While Peter learns hard lessons about pain and purpose in the shadow of Hell's Kitchen's guardian, he remains oblivious to the Grandmaster pulling the strings. From Gotham to New York, Schiller isn't just a mentor. He's a manipulator running a city-wide therapy session, breaking down heroes not to save them, but to reshape them in the crucible of their own trauma. Strange swallowed hard. Schiller's ice-gray eyes were like an abyss, silently assessing him, and any words of refusal felt feeble under such a gaze. Strange was certain that the man before him was no ordinary person to be judged by conventional standards. He was dragged into the car by a force that brooked no resistance, but the pride of a top surgeon compelled him to speak. "I must state for the record, I am a doctor, not God. If your friend is already dead, no threat will bring him back." Schiller's face was sharply defined by the shifting lights and shadows outside the car window. He gripped the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road, his voice as steady as a scalpel drawn across a metal tray. "We are both doctors, a fact I understand better than you. I sought you out precisely because I am certain that only you can save him." Strange relaxed slightly, but his brow remained furrowed in a show of defiance. "You're just a psychiatrist. In the field of neurosurgery, I would advise you not to be so arbitrary." The words had barely left his mouth when the cold touch of metal was once again pressed precisely against his forehead. Strange's pupils contracted. It was a ballpoint pen, yet Schiller's hands had remained firmly on the steering wheel the entire time. The pen simply hung there, suspended in mid-air, exuding a supernatural sense of pressure. Strange immediately raised a hand and mimed zipping his lips, his eyes signaling he would not speak another word. At the other end of the hospital, a tidal wave of guilt threatened to drown Peter Parker. He stood like a statue, guarding the operating room door, determined not to let so much as a fly pass. Yet, from the shadows, a figure crept silently toward the door. Matt's former girlfriend, Elektra. She had not come for revenge. On the contrary, she had seen the conspiracy against Matt long before anyone else. Elektra had been trying to warn him, but Matt had moved too fast, and by the time she arrived, the tragedy had already occurred. Her relationship with Matt was a tangled knot of love, conflict, and allegiance. As an assassin hired by Kingpin, she had always held back in their encounters, but it was precisely her hesitation that had given others an opening. With Matt's life hanging by a thread, her inner turmoil was greater than anyone's. Raised in privilege, Elektra was worldly and knew just how fatal Matt's injuries were. Conventional medicine was a lost cause. If there was a sliver of hope, it lay in the forbidden, mystical arts. She had to intervene. Perhaps only the secret techniques of the hand, the power of the beast, could pull Matt back from the brink of death. Elektra activated her ninja stealth techniques, her form melting into the surroundings. The Heis-Ku, aged boy at the door was, in her eyes, negligible. Days of observation had convinced her that Peter was a clumsy amateur with brute strength, but no actual fighting skill. She planned to simply pass through him and enter the operating room. But she had miscalculated one thing. Peter Parker had the spider sense. At this moment, under the crushing weight of extreme tension and self-blame, his senses were amplified to an unprecedented degree. The instant Elektra's form drew near, Peter whipped his head around, his eyes locking onto a patch of empty air by the corner of the wall. He felt someone there. With a suppressed roar, his fist tore through the air and smashed toward the spot. Elektra knew the terrifying extent of Peter's strength and dared not take the blow head on, but his movements were, to her, riddled with flaws. He leaned too far forward with his punch, his stance unstable and artless. With a flicker of movement, Elektra's arm coiled around Peter's wrist like a serpent, pulling him forward. Peter instantly lost his balance and pitched forward. A simple trip of her foot sent him sprawling cleanly to the floor. But in the instant he fell, anxiety and adrenaline seemed to unlock an instinctual use of his powers. His body, upon hitting the floor, recoiled like a maximally compressed spring, launching him back up. His arms clamped around Elektra's lower back like a vise. Elektra was just as desperate, both of them teetering on the edge of control. But she was, after all, a top assassin trained by the hand. The moment she was seized, her other hand, gripping a short blade, swung backward in a lethal arc. The blade, trailing an invisible edge of force, sliced from Peter's shoulder blade down to his lowest rib, nearly cleaving his torso in two. In an instant, unimaginable pain consumed Peter's nerves, the agony igniting every ounce of potential within him. He let out a choked cry and, with all his might, threw Elektra from him. She slammed hard against the wall at the end of the hallway, unable to rise for a moment. Peter collapsed to the ground, feeling as if the pain would kill him. The blade had not only torn through the muscles of his back, but its razor, sharp aura, had also cut into his lung. With every breath, hot blood surged up his windpipe. This was the first time in Peter Parker's life that he had experienced such pure, soul-shattering pain. The punches he had taken a few days ago were child's play compared to the wound now gaping across his body. His entire back felt as if it had been pierced by a white, hot brand, and the damage to his lung turned every inhalation into an act of torture. Physiological tears streamed from his eyes as a low moan of agony was forced from deep in his throat. He suddenly realized that heroes, they could get hurt and they could bleed. When heroes were hurt, the pain was unbearable. Possessing special abilities granted no immunity to suffering. Fortunately, his astonishing healing factor began to work within a few breaths. Through his blurring vision, he glanced at the operating room. Through the frosted glass, he could see the outline of Matt lying on the table. Daredevil's head was turned to one side, his eyes still open. He was conscious but completely paralyzed. Peter's heart sank. Daredevil didn't have a healing factor. He was dying. He was just a blind man who knew some martial arts, and now his entire spine was broken. The pain must be immense, 1,000 times worse than what Peter was feeling now. Yet he couldn't even make a sound. Terror and despair seized Peter. For the fragile life of such a hero he felt a bone, deep sorrow and rage. But more than that, it was the overwhelming guilt and self-recrimination that completely submerged him. An ordinary man with no superpowers had fought an entire underground boxing ring to save him, and he, upon hearing the criminal's plot, had chosen to walk away because it wasn't his problem. His choice had led to this, to a true hero suffering a devastating blow, now on the verge of death. Matt is the hero, I'm not. The intense emotional storm made his spider sense scream with a piercing hum. In that instant, Peter's potential was fully unleashed, and the entire world before his eyes shattered and reformed. Electra had instantly activated her stealth to vanish completely. Yet Peter, his eyes blood red, pinpointed her location in a fraction of a second. The clumsy boy from moments ago vanished from his spot. The next second, an irresistible force slammed Electra against the wall. She coughed up a mouthful of blood and used the last of her strength to flee in disarray. This was the scene that greeted Schiller upon his return to the hospital. Beneath a wall on the verge of crumbling, Peter sat numbly, his eyes so red it looked as if they might bleed. Strange entered the operating room. The night was now as thick as ink. Schiller walked over and stood silently opposite Peter. "Peter," Schiller's voice echoed in the empty corridor. "I didn't expect we would meet again under these circumstances." Peter's reaction was slow. He didn't immediately grasp the meaning of Schiller's words. Schiller slowly crouched down, bringing his gaze level with Peter's, and said, "I apologize for not being able to accompany you for that checkup. As you can see, I no longer work at this hospital." A flicker of recognition returned to Peter. "It's you. You're that doctor." He remembered now, the psychologist he had been communicating with online. Schiller nodded. "Yes, it's me." Peter hung his head in silence, his voice laced with defeat. "I must have disappointed you. I'm nothing like I was in our chats. I screwed everything up. I almost got my friend killed." Schiller's tone was devoid of any ripple. "I imagine you have come to understand a few things." "Yes, yes." Peter's voice was hoarse. "The biggest thing I understand is that getting hurt, it really hurts." "It hurt that much, and yet he still did it," Peter whispered. "He's a hero and I'm not. Maybe I can never be a hero." Schiller's voice remained calm, without a hint of blame, merely stating a fact. "Perhaps you have learned that in this world, if those with power choose to stand by and do nothing, then when disaster befalls you, no one will come to save you either. Perhaps you feel your life is terrible right now, but even so, this not-so-great life is being protected for you by people willing to make sacrifices. Even the beggars in Hell's Kitchen can only find a corner to survive in after Daredevil has cleared the thugs off the streets." "Peter," Schiller's tone sharpened slightly, as if delivering a verdict, "perhaps it is not my place to say this, but right now, I'm afraid I am the only one who can. With great power comes great responsibility." Peter Parker silently closed his eyes. In the pre-dawn hours, the city's darkest moment, the operating room door opened. Stripping off his blood-stained gloves, Strange walked out, a look of weary professionalism on his face. "Congratulations, the surgery was a success. There's an 80% chance of full neurological recovery." Hearing those words, Peter's tense body finally broke. He let out a long, suppressed roar, as if to purge every emotion from his chest. He spun around, leaped directly out the window, and clung to the building's exterior, scrambling upward with the speed of a true spider. In a few bounds, he vanished over the rooftop. He began to race across the New York skyline, using speed to vent the storm inside him. Just then the gold and red iron suit appeared in his vision once more, circling him like a silent guide. Without hesitation, Peter followed. One chasing the other, they vaulted across the peaks of the concrete jungle, finally stopping at the highest point of the New York television tower. The two stood at the spire, looking down at the sleeping city below. Peter desperately wanted to scream, but not a sound could escape his throat. All his emotions were lodged in his chest, and he felt like he was about to explode. With a soft whir, Stark's faceplate retracted, revealing his world-famous face. Peter was stunned. "You're Tony Stark. Iron Man is Stark." "What's so surprising, kid?" Stark's voice carried his signature swagger. Who else but the owner of Stark Industries could build a toy like this? "But the news said you were kidnapped in Afghanistan." "That's right. Want to know how I escaped?" Peter looked at him. Stark pointed to his own chest, where a faint blue light glowed beneath his clothes. "I built an energy source, and then I installed it right here. There's still an arc reactor under here. In a cave in Afghanistan, I cut open my own chest and stuffed a bunch of metal parts inside. My own blood soaked through my pants." Just imagining the scene made Peter's chest ache in sympathy. That must have been rough. Of course, it hurt like hell. Stark shrugged with feigned nonchalance, but Peter could hear the tremor he tried so hard to conceal. "You have to cut open your own chest cavity with a not-so-sharp bone saw, then sew the wires into your own flesh, one by one." A chill ran down Peter's spine. He had never imagined that the playboy from the news, perpetually surrounded by beautiful women and champagne, the billionaire who seemed to have everything, had also endured such a brutal past. He too had bled so much, had withstood pain that no mortal should have to bear. "I may call myself a genius, but I know better than anyone that one bullet can make me bleed out. One piece of shrapnel can shred my heart, and I'm not walking anywhere if I lose a leg. And yet, I happen to do a lot of work that carries exactly those risks." "You think I do it for the thrill?" Stark asked. "I'm the richest man in the world. I have power most people can't even imagine. I have zero reason to put on this expensive suit and save ordinary people whose monthly salary couldn't buy a single screw on it, let alone risk my life doing it." Spider-Man closed his eyes and was silent for a long time. Then he said softly, "With great power comes great responsibility, right?" Stark didn't answer. He just pointed again to the spot over his heart. Peter understood. He already had the answer. Facing New York's first ray of dawn, Peter and Stark stood shoulder to shoulder at the top of the television tower. The golden light cut through the clouds, bathing the entire city in a splendid radiance. From this day forward, Peter Parker, Spider-Man, finally understood a truth. So-called heroes are also mortal. They feel pain, they get injured, they bleed, they are lonely, they become lost. The only thing that separates them from the masses is an innate sense of duty and a resolve to uphold justice until death. No one in this world is born immune to pain. They simply take the blood and bone carved by their suffering and, while walking through the darkness, forge it into an unbreakable suit of armor. All so that when the sun rises, they can use that armor to save the world. For the first time, Spider-Man slowly stood up straight on the tower's iron frame. He wasn't yet wearing the red and blue suit, and his frame was not yet fully grown, but in that moment his soul stood as tall as a mountain. The tempest of emotions raging in his chest finally coalesced into an unprecedented strength, spreading from his wounds to consume his entire being. Facing the first light of dawn, Schiller looked out the window as the skyline was traced in pale gold. "The sun is up," he thought. "Time to save the world." Inside the ICU, the monotonous, steady beeping of machines charted the fine line between life and death for Matt Murdock. Though the surgery had been a success, he was not yet out of danger. Schiller turned to Strange, whose face was etched with the fatigue and annoyance of a 10-hour procedure. He spoke, his voice steadily breaking the morning silence. "I owe you for this, Dr. Strange. Should you ever require my assistance, do not hesitate to ask." Strange's gaze, usually scalpel sharp, was clouded. He refused without ceremony. "Let's hope it never comes to that. Frankly, I have no desire to see you again." Schiller was unbothered, the corner of his mouth instead curling into an inscrutable arc. "You have seen a fraction of what I can do. So, allow me to offer a piece of professional advice, free of charge." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze precisely capturing every flicker in the other man's eyes. "Be careful when you drive. Don't play your cryptic little games with me." Strange waved a dismissive hand and turned to leave. "I'm going back to bed." Schiller simply shrugged at his departing figure. He knew that once the trajectory of fate was set, it could hardly be altered by words. In his current state of supreme self-regard, any advice would simply glance off Strange's towering ego. But that was fine. When the inevitable car crash came, when he was desperate for any cure for the hands he took so much pride in, he would surely remember the freak's a prophecy from this day. Back at the clinic, a deep sleep dispelled his exhaustion. When Schiller awoke, the system interface notified him that he had gained 2 new random chat opportunities. He analyzed the situation calmly. This meant he had once again significantly influenced 2 pivotal characters, Daredevil and Spider-Man. He decided to use one immediately. Matt's near death state was a blaring alarm, reminding him that his own defenses and reaction speed remained a fatal weakness. Even with the ability to teleport, in a life-or-death moment that lasted a fraction of a second, no one could guarantee a perfect response. Relying on the wildly fluctuating Spider-Sense was tantamount to leaving his life in the hands of a gambler. Schiller opened the chat system, his fingertip tapping lightly on the random chat button. A connection was established. This time, however, the entity on the other end was unsettling. The avatar frame was a bottomless, pitch-black void, like the vacuum of space, with only 2 points of faint light shimmering within, like eyes peering out from an abyss. The moment the connection went through, a torrent of completely unintelligible language flooded Schiller's mind. This was different from any previous experience. All his other chat partners had used English. Even the telepathic communication with the Ancient One had been composed of clear, discernible thoughts. But this entity's vocalizations were complex and grating, like grinding metal, like shattering stars. He silently queried the system. Can the system not translate this? What language is it? Thanks to his past life's experience as a visiting scholar at various universities, he had a passing knowledge of major European languages in addition to his fluency in Chinese and English. But this sound belonged to no language he recognized. The system's reply was concise and cold. The chat system will automatically translate any known language. If incomprehensible content appears, it indicates a fundamental biological divergence between the host and the other party, or that understanding their language requires a specialized cognitive organ to be deciphered. Schiller understood instantly. The being on the other end was not human. That long string of syllables was perhaps not language at all, but a signal that required a specific receiving organ to decode. He clicked on the avatar, and a few words written in a universal cosmic script appeared. God of the symbiotes, null. Schiller's eyebrows rose slightly. He hadn't expected this random connection to lead directly to the progenitor of the abyss. The comics had already provided a detailed profile of this ancient being. A lord of the void who had existed since the birth of the universe, who had once wielded the all-black necrosword and personally decapitated a celestial. He created the symbiotes, assembling a sky-blotting dark legion and great dragons, spreading fear across the ruins of countless civilizations. That was, until he turned his gaze to Earth and was defeated by a furious Thor wielding the power of 1,000 lightning strikes, severing his connection to the vast majority of his creations. Those symbiotes, scattered across the cosmos, gradually came to realize the evil of their creator after bonding with countless kind and rational alien races. They eventually staged a collective rebellion, imprisoning their god on a desolate planet called Clinter, the so-called symbiote homeworld. Schiller didn't rush to use his second chat opportunity, instead listening with great interest to Null's incoherent rage. The ancient god's monologue had not ceased since the connection began. It was logical enough that English wasn't the universal language. Schiller couldn't understand a single word, but that didn't stop him from discerning certain universal patterns within the waves of fury. He analyzed Null's voice as he would the unconscious ramblings of a psychiatric patient. After repeated confirmation, Schiller reached a conclusion. The Lord of the Abyss was cursing up a storm. Indeed, life forms could be vastly different, but the expression of pure rage was remarkably universal. The violent tone that pervaded the entire tirade and certain high-frequency phonemes carrying obvious derogatory weight were a language common to all intelligent life. Schiller shrewdly picked up on a recurring syllable, Clinter. He deduced this was likely the symbiote equivalent of the human F-word. And so, during a brief lull in Null's latest furious roar, Schiller calmly typed and sent a single syllable. Clinter. On the other end, the roar from the abyss fell bizarrely silent. The god of the symbiotes, who had insulted the cosmos for countless eons, was, for the first time, being sworn at with his own profanity. Schiller's guess had been dead on. After a short, dead silence came an even more violent torrent of language. But Schiller merely waited for the pauses and returned, with measured calm, Clinter. Having heard it enough, he even learned a few new swear words, perfectly mimicking the subtle trills and pronunciations. Null continued to vent his rage, while Schiller calmly selected his vocabulary and returned fire with precision. He can hardly climb through the data stream to throttle me, Schiller thought. So what if he's the Lord of the Abyss? So what if he's killed a celestial? As he traded insults with the ancient god, Schiller rapidly organized the intel he had on him. The god of the symbiotes was certainly unlucky, betrayed by his own children, and imprisoned on a lonely planet day after day, year after year. Anyone in his position would likely be driven mad. Next, Schiller turned his attention to ability replication. He hesitated. Null's most fundamental ability was to create and divide symbiotes, but Schiller had no interest in an ability that involved slicing off pieces of himself that could betray him at any moment. He clicked the option to copy the ability and saw that the words had turned a striking red, with a note in parentheses, warning, the target's ability is currently mutating. Copy with caution. This was the first time Schiller had encountered such a situation. It all stemmed from Null's prison break plan. The imprisoned god was naturally unwilling to remain subdued. Schiller's arrival was, one might say, impeccably timed. Null's not so brilliant mind, relying on biological instinct, had conceived of an escape. Knowing his offspring had varied abilities, he planned to create an unprecedentedly special symbiote, one without a physical body, composed purely of a mist of consciousness. If he could transfer his own consciousness into it, he might be able to escape the planet's shackles. It wasn't a particularly clever plan, but for a prisoner whose daily routine consisted of little more than swearing and spawning offspring, it was his only hope. Just as he had created this new offspring and was preparing for the crucial consciousness transfer, Schiller's chat request came through. This was why his ability status was displayed as mutating, because his very essence was in the process of transforming into that new, mist-like form. Under normal circumstances, it would be nearly impossible for Schiller to copy a power like Null's, which originated from the primordial fabric of the cosmos, be it the living abyss of the necrosword or his innate talent for splitting off dark creatures. These abilities had no source that could be parsed by the system, and even if they could, Schiller wouldn't have chosen them. So, he chose to copy the mutating ability without hesitation. A power of evasion or stealth would be an immense gain. Even a simple combat skin, akin to the common symbiote, would be a net positive. Begin replication. Symbiote Gray Mist's special ability has been equipped. In an instant, Schiller's perception was fractured. He now possessed another field of vision, one that observed the world through his eyes, but was not under his direct control. Yet all its signals ultimately fed into his brain. He felt as if a nascent, chaotic consciousness had been grafted directly onto his own. But it was not a foreign object. An ability copied by the system could only become a part of the host. This symbiote was not a parasite like venom that could detach at will, but had instead become one of Schiller's organs, an inalienable new part of him that would live and die with him. It retained some symbiotic traits, for instance, the capacity for independent thought. Schiller could clearly feel a region of his brain being completely reshaped, this symbiote becoming a new component of his cerebrum. Their communication was more like a dialogue between a primary and a newly born secondary personality within a single body. This symbiote was far more special than Schiller had imagined. When creating it, Null had poured into it ambitions far beyond mere escape. And after being copied and modified by the system to fuse perfectly with Schiller, it had become a unique new life form in the universe, one with infinite potential. The symbiote's learning speed was astonishing. In the course of a single afternoon, the nascent voice in Schiller's mind was already capable of simple emotional exchanges with him via direct telepathy. Once they could communicate smoothly, Schiller decided to test its abilities. His first impulse was to test its physical manifestation. He wondered if, like its more common brethren, it would respond to a simple command, a mental equivalent of mask on, and envelop him in a protective carapace, perhaps even the monstrous, fanged visage of its kin. The symbiote could read Schiller's mental projections directly. The instant the image of the slimy, fanged creature formed in his mind, a series of frantic, protesting thoughts flooded his consciousness. I am not slimy, I am not slimy, I am not slimy, I am not slimy. The nascent consciousness's protest carried a hint of genuine grievance. It seemed to have precisely grasped Schiller's deep-seated revulsion for the traditional symbiote form. Schiller was unmoved. It wasn't a matter of simple dislike, but of a deep-seated physiological intolerance. No matter how powerful a symbiote might be, its texture, like a puddle of rotting sludge, was enough to trigger his most primal, visceral disgust. As if eager to prove its point, the gray mist, having only just mastered communication, brazenly seized control of Schiller's body without his command. Schiller felt his body stand up involuntarily. The next moment, the world before his eyes completely dissolved. He no longer had eyes, or rather, he no longer had a tangible, flesh-end, blood body at all. In its place were countless microscopic sensors suspended in the air. Every detail of the clinic bedroom flooded his brain with unprecedented clarity. This was not seeing, but a more fundamental perceiving. He could feel the raised texture of every single fiber on the bed sheets, a domain his human senses could never hope to access. At first, the tsunami of information nearly overwhelmed his mind, but the second consciousness within his own, the symbiote, processed, filtered, and organized the deluge at an impossible speed, presenting it back to Schiller in a coherent, manageable stream. The countless details converged into a sense of absolute, intoxicating control. Then, Schiller found he could direct this state. He began to consciously deploy these sensors, ordering them to spread outward like an invisible net. When this net touched the full-length mirror in the bedroom, Schiller finally perceived his current form, a shifting, amorphous cloud of gray mist. He had been completely liberated from the shackles of a physical body. Every particle in the mist had become one of his sensory nerve endings, billions of symbiotic motes weaving together into a vast intelligence network that left no corner unobserved. Where there was a gap, there could be no secrets. He could even perceive the arrangement of iron atoms on the inner wall of the electric kettle. If he concentrated, he could feel the precise distribution of oxygen and noble gases in the air. This microscopic power of observation, approaching the molecular and atomic levels, revealed the world to him in all its unprecedented grandeur and beauty. "Thank God you're not that sludge." Schiller's thoughts conveyed a sliver of genuine satisfaction. The gray mist seemed to sense this approval and sent back a wave of jubilant emotion. To further demonstrate its power, it took direct control of Schiller's mist form and expanded it explosively. The gray mist no longer cohered, but diffused silently like a true morning fog, quickly blanketing the entirety of Hell's Kitchen. The countless particles became more dispersed, but the information transfer never ceased. Instead, it grew exponentially as the area expanded. With the symbiote's auxiliary processing, Schiller only needed to focus his attention on a single point. Right now, for instance, he could clearly hear the gunshots of a gang war 6 blocks away, and could even track the searing trajectory of each bullet as it tore through the air. He issued a command: "Find a bald man with a bull's eye tattoo on his forehead." The gray mist locked onto the target instantly. Bullseye's environment, the airflow around him, the trajectory of dust motes in his path. All the micro-information was transmitted back to Schiller's brain. The power was near omniscient. Within the mist's reach, nothing could hide. Schiller knew that his own human brain would have been overwhelmed by this terrifying data stream and driven insane. But this symbiote seemed innately equipped to handle it all. He was like an intelligence agency with eyes on every corner, looking down upon the city of sin. Nothing that stirred within the mist could escape his notice. Not only that, but these miraculous particles could also permeate the interior of matter, destroying it at a molecular level and turning solid objects to dust in an instant. The gray mist also relayed, however, that this ability was only effective on inorganic matter with stable structures, and could not be under the influence of any external energy. But that was more than enough. When he wished to return to his human form, he could choose to recondense his body at any point within the mist's reach. This meant that within the effective range of the gray mist, he could achieve a near-infinite number of teleportations. Of course, this couldn't entirely replace his blink ability, as dematerializing, expanding, and reforming a human body took time, far slower than the instantaneous flash of a blink. Things on the Marvel side had quieted down for the time being. Matt was still recovering, Peter Parker was pinned to his desk by final exams, and Tony Stark had locked himself in his lab all day to avoid Nick Fury's pestering. During a deep sleep, Schiller's consciousness quietly returned to that rain-drenched DC world. However, upon his return, Schiller discovered a rather troublesome characteristic of his new internal companion. Back in his Gotham apartment, Schiller began to organize his equipment. With Jonathan Crane's arrest, the source of fear toxin had been cut off, but fortunately, he had already cleaned out nearly all of Scarecrow's inventory, with the remainder being a highly concentrated premium stock. He was taking out a vial of the concentrated solution, preparing to dilute and package it. The fear toxin had no effect on him, so he couldn't be bothered to take Crane's meticulous precautions. The only two living things in the apartment, Schiller and his pet Pikachu, were both immune to the stuff. His brutish methods, completely devoid of any chemical background, broke enough lab safety protocols in a minute to fill an entire report. Not wearing gloves or a mask was just the baseline. Consequently, after he finished his work, the room was always filled with a low concentration of fear toxin. This time was no different. As Schiller completed a series of highly non-standard chemical dilutions and transferred the gas into several spray bottles, a signal of extreme excitement suddenly flared up in his brain. "This is delicious. This is delicious. Delicious. Let me eat. Food, food, food." Schiller froze. Was the symbiote saying the fear toxin was delicious? He immediately made the connection to Venom's lore. The reason Venom could substitute chocolate for brains was that both contained phenylethylamine, a chemical that triggers feelings of excitement in the brain. Could it be that Scarecrow's fear toxin also contained this? Schiller thought for a moment and concluded it was highly likely. The toxin induced a person's deepest fears and dramatically amplified negative emotions. It was hard to believe Crane hadn't used a similar stimulant in its concoction. It now seemed he not only used it, but in a significant dose. "How do you consume it?" Schiller asked in his mind. The symbiote didn't seem to know either. It only knew the substance before it held a fatal attraction. Schiller had no choice but to pick up a bottle of the diluted toxin and give a light spray toward his own mouth and nose. Instantly, he could feel the symbiote in his brain go into a complete frenzy. Delicious, delicious, not enough, more, more, more. Apparently, all symbiotes shared a voracious appetite. Schiller steeled himself, picked up a small vial of the undiluted liquid concentrate, and downed it in one go. The liquid toxin itself was tasteless, but the moment it slid down his throat, Schiller could feel the symbiote inside him become deliriously ecstatic. A long string of completely unintelligible brainwaves came flooding in as it used every word it had just learned to scream and roar in his mind. A few moments later, a black mist, darker than the usual gray, began to emanate from Schiller's body. Schiller sniffed the air. It was thick with the smell of fear toxin. He understood. High-potency fear toxin was, to the symbiote, like hard liquor. The gray mist was completely drunk, and its reaction to being drunk was startlingly similar to a human's. First, it flew into a rage, and then it threw up. The black toxic mist now filling the room was its vomit. The gray mist recovered quickly, but the first thing it did upon sobering up was to whine and plead with Schiller for more of the fine wine. Schiller sternly refused. It clearly wasn't willing to give up, expressing its grievances and cravings in his mind in every way it could. Schiller felt a wave of helplessness. Why did other hosts get lethal protectors, while he was saddled with a drunkard?